Freemasonry, as it is practiced today, was founded in 1717. It is 300 years old. However, despite its continued presence in modern societies and with around 5 million members worldwide, few institutions are so little known. The issue that brings us together today is the noticeable absence of women in Freemasonry historically and their persistent endorsement for taking part in the enlightenment work that the Masonic activity brings to humanity. But to cast a little light to the subject, we will have to briefly summarize the complex socio-historical phenomenon, past and present, by taking a multi-phased approach rather than merely the historical. Let me place the topic within a definition from outside the world of Freemasonry. Then I will sketch out a brief history to succinctly demonstrate how the concept of Freemasonry practiced today has gradually evolved in a historical continuum that has enabled the raw material of Masonry to develop from concept to practice. I will conclude my introduction by providing a more grounded explanation of the very essence of Freemasonry to facilitate our interpretation of other aspects and manifestations of Masonry. Especially aspects and manifestations can be interpreted, and above all, the issue of the appropriate role of women. So, let's start with the definition. I have chosen one attributable to Professor Ferrer Benimeli, which states, compared to the old Masons or Masons of the Middle Ages, builders of stone cathedrals who worshipped the great architect of the universe, contemporary Freemasonry presents itself as an association that defends human dignity, solidarity, and fraternity with the goal of achieve the moral and cultural improvement of its members by building a symbolic temple dedicated to virtue. Following the proposed plan, I will lay out a brief history in 3 stages, which will allow us to better understand the foundations of this institution. I will call these 3 stages operational Freemasonry, transitional Freemasonry, and speculative Freemasonry. Operative Freemasonry. We have to imagine for ourselves 18th century attitudes to know or imagine the importance of the guild organizations that flourished in Europe between the 11th and 16th centuries. Bear in mind that at that time we are in a mostly illiterate society, in which there are no professional and regulated institutions or degree programs in architecture or engineering. This environment enabled Masonry to dispense all the practical and theoretical knowledge necessary for the exercise of the profession of an architect and an engineer. What today would be knowledge of physics, geometry, the resistance of materials, engineering, design, architecture, and even theology and history of religion. Quarry workers, divided into brotherhoods, not only had theoretical knowledge but also organizational and pedagogical know-how that today we would call human resources, because they had developed a system of apprenticeships, colleagues, and teachers who transmitted with equal zeal a solid deontological code. The transition Freemasonry. In the 16th century, the ruling classes, nobility and clergy, lost interest in building cathedrals, great monuments, and palaces, among other reasons because they could not finance themselves. At the same time, the evolution of the bourgeois developed a need for craftsmen and urban workers. More was being built, but of a kind that did not require the vast knowledge of traditional Masons. Consequently, the lodges of the operational Masons began to languish as the call for their skills decreased. Their demise also was accelerated by the founding of the first academies of architecture, which were responsible for the teaching function previously occupied by the trade union system. During the almost 2 centuries of operational Freemason decline, another Freemasonry evolved in an unstructured way, the one called in the language of that time accepted Masons, or Freemason gentlemen. This eventually evolved into what would be known as speculative Freemasonry, and is the one we currently know. In fact, as the numbers of operating Masons in these lodges declined, the presence of people of social importance, intellectuals, artists, etc., increased. They hadn't been directly linked to the building trades before, but they became interested in its social and practical benefits. These people were called accepted Masons, and they became steadily more interested in the lodge's pedagogical, moral, and intellectual values because of their special work ethic. We can only speculate on how this evolution took place. Although myriad theories abound, we can think that the coexistence of 2 intellectual worlds with different perceptions, although not necessarily based in reality, eventually found common ground, that of the elements and tools of construction converted into symbols to explain life and humanity. For the Mason, the stone was a sacred element, a living piece of nature that they had to master to turn into a useful unit of construction. They had to know the extent of its hardness, the places where it could be split, its natural vertical position, in short, everything that communicated the essence of the stone to the mason, because in coming to familiarize themselves with it, they could harness it for their use. The stone was the raw material from which elegant shapes emerged, daring curves, the ethereal holes destined for people's complaints and prayers to be transmitted to the Creator. When an operative Mason tried to explain to an accepted Mason what the stone meant to them, if the latter were a writer, for example, they would extrapolate from the function that the stone fulfilled in a creation the function of the words in their writing. A slow process emerged that involved translating the everyday elements of physical work into a symbolic language, from initiation rituals to the tools and processes of construction. This phenomena occurred simultaneously and in parallel throughout Europe, without there being any stated intention to homogenize or ensure the survival of these schools of fraternity. The speculative Freemasonry. But for sure, a much more subtle change has been taking place during the periods that we labeled operational and transitional Freemasonry. Freemasonry had a strong initiation ritual, because anyone who wanted to enter a guild had to undergo an initiation ritual that guaranteed the initiate's conduct in regard to the proper exercise of their profession and required secrecy. It was an initiation that did not involve the individual's spiritual transformation, but knowledge of the profession, the ability to teach it, improvement, and secrecy. With the birth of speculative Freemasonry, when we have shifted from the physical stone concept to theory, the initiatory process would develop a new dimension. Now, the object of attention and concern was no longer the construction of a cathedral. It was the construction of human beings themselves. This concern could not be ignored because the imagery had been directed toward providing society with fundamental materials with which to build this new person. This slow process culminates in 1717. Protestant pastors Desaguliers and Anderson are responsible for drafting a founding document known as the Constitutions of Anderson that is revealed in 1723. All modern Freemasonry agrees that this document constitutes the historical origin of this era. But as we have seen, that birth was not a more or less happy occurrence involving some enlightened members, but the result of a suspension that originates much further back in time and that has its origins in a particular perception of human action. This concept endows human creativity an ontological rank because through modifying reality, a person not only changes the world, but can also change themselves. We now conclude the historical section and undertake as succinct an effort as possible to answer the question: what is Freemasonry? Operative Freemasonry passed on initiatory rites the symbols of the tools of construction, the operational, managerial, and pedagogical customs that organized the life of the Freemason around the basic core of the lodge. Since Freemasonry changed the world of stone to that of ideas in everyday life, that is, when it ceased to be operative Freemasonry and became speculative Freemasonry, its transcendent expression abandoned the construction of awe-inspiring cathedrals and beautiful buildings for the field of intellectual production in the broadest sense of the concept. Undoubtedly, this has shaped the type of work that takes place in Masonic lodges, both from the training and from the production point of view. But it has also influenced the spectrum of motivations that energize the Freemason. They are now people interested in getting to know the world around them by understanding it and taking part in daily activity. Reason, or rather thinking, has become a regulating principle of the Masonic milieu. It's significant that to the right of the worshipful master of a lodge is an image of goddess Athena, who, as we know, ruled not only the arts and wisdom, but also the sciences. Moreover, for Freemasons, human reason is the architect of their freedom as an individual builder, creator, and designer of their life. It is precisely in the reason's creative dimension that the Masonic method reaches its true operability. When a new brother or sister enters Freemasonry, in fact, they enter a complex world of symbols whose meaning they must uncover. From the beginning, they are taught that there is a reason for each one's existence. Nothing in the lodge is by chance, and their job is to observe, investigate, reflect, and meditate until they can unravel its deeper meaning. Thus, Freemasonry is an initiative fraternal society that offers its members rituals and symbols on the one hand, and space and workspace on the other. These allow them to adequately address the human's moral improvement within their social environment based on three fundamental principles: freedom, equality, and fraternity. Masonic brothers and sisters must make no distinction in race, religion, gender, creed, ideology, social status, or economic position. For Freemasonry, humans are the masters of their thoughts and actions. The Mason is and must be essentially free. The purpose of Freemasonry is the attainment of happiness in spiritual and material terms. but at the same time it is aware that no society can achieve happiness if it is not built so that everyone is included, women and men, and that their society offers possibilities for their development. If we do not know what the hidden determinants human nature are, what they need to be happy, if we do not know what development means, we can hardly design the ideal society. That is why Freemasonry strives to achieve its objective by focusing on the knowledge of the intimate architecture of the human being, without losing sight of the context that is the society and its nature. In individual and societal conflict rest the main problems that have dogged humans throughout history. Humans are social construct and society is a collection of individuals. This co-implication, this ambiguity, which as we shall see is existentially manifested, is what the Masonic method attempts to address with its parcel of traditions. The absence of women in operative Freemasonry and traditional Freemasonry is not what concerns me because, as we said before, it was an initiation process for the trades. What does worry me is their absence in speculative Freemasonry. It is explicitly laid out in Anderson's constitutions that we are no longer excluded from initiation into the trades Mason, but from a spiritual initiation to acquire universal values, which are inalienable right of every human being, male or female. Some historical considerations about the presence of women in Freemasonry. We will start by considering the issue from a historical point of view. We have to look at the period when operative Freemasonry was transformed into speculative Freemasonry to understand women's role at that time. In the 14th and 15th centuries, women were not free and were always dependent on men, with some exceptions in the case of queens or abbesses, or some noble women, mainly widows with considerable assets. Women did not participate in society. They were essentially invisible since all important decisions were made by men. So, it was normal at that time to exclude women from the stonecutters and carvers guilds, and consequently from the lodges, where the decisions regarding the trades were discussed. Some data tells us that there were some women involved in and sharing men's work in the building industry. There is evidence of this in the lodges of the quarries that handed out the work. So, women show up in Durham and Carnarvon lodges in 1337 Great Britain. There are records of women in the medieval builders' corporations in Paris, 1292, Chester, 1327, York, 1350, Norwich, 1375. And the famous case of Sabine Steinbach, daughter of the master builder of Strasbourg Cathedral, who was a sculptor in Strasbourg and Marburg. The rules of the Grand Lodge of York, dated October 23, 1696, reproduced in a manuscript of the Lodge number 236 of the same name, about the way to induct apprentices. Quote, "He or she who is to be trained as a mason places their hands on the book, and the instructions are given to them." End quote. This text shows that the person who is being initiated can be male or female, and that the secrets of Freemasonry are also passed on to them without gender discrimination. But I think that all these cases were anecdotal, because when the constitutions of Anderson were published in the year 1723, they say, "The people admitted as members of a lodge must be good and loyal men, born free, adults, mature and cautious, neither slaves nor women, not immoral men or prone to scandalous behavior, but of good character." 51 years later, on June 10, 1774, the Grand Orient of France officially authorized adoption of the lodges. These lodges were created for women by male Freemasons under the permanent tutelage and vigilance of male Freemasons, who presided over their meetings. The female members were dedicated mainly to charity and to organize the activities of male Freemasons. I doubt that Masonic initiatory work took place in these lodges. On January 14, 1882, the first mixed group of inductees formed the Mixed Masonic Order of Human Rights, where men and women began to work on an equal status. The Freethinkers Lodge in the east of Pec, France, initiated Maria Erasmus, who was a premier journalist and feminist. Later, a group of women organized themselves with the help of Senator Georges Martin. Professor Pedro Alvarez tells us in his book La Masonería, Escuela de Formación del Ciudadano. In Spain, the role of some free-thinking Freemasons was important in promoting the feminist movement. One of them was Belén Zárraga, who was born in Málaga and worked very actively to promote feminism within the Freemasonry. Other Masonic documents provide evidence of the Masonic activities of Sister Justice because in the books of the Constancia Alona Lodge in Alicante, that was her symbolic name. Ángeles López de Ayala was born in Seville in 1856 and belonged to the male lodge Constancia de Gracia of Barcelona. She reached the 30th degree and held the positions of secretary and speaker. Moreover, Rosario Acuña, Amalia, and Ana Carvia from Cádiz and Carmen de Burgos founded the Lodge Love No. 1, and Clara Campoamor gets the courts to approve the women's vote in Spain in October 1st, 1931. This is mentioned in the Constitution of 1931, the article number 36. Although women in Freemasonry worked very actively, there were only a few of them. They all claimed equal rights between men and women inside and outside of Freemasonry, as well as the importance of women receiving an education that would enable them to make their own decisions with greater knowledge. But Freemasonry has always been, and is still today, mostly male. In Spain, women are incorporated on an equal status within the men since 1993 in the Grand Symbolic Spanish Lodge. Exercising freedom of thought meant for them to fight for the equality of women in the same fields as men: the university, the Congress, intellectual circles, etc. At that time, Spanish women were ahead of the rest of Europe in issues involving their equality with men, and these gains were mainly achieved by the women who fought so boldly for this cause. With the dictatorship, we lost everything we achieved, and we were left far behind the rest of Europe. Concerns about the rights of women within the lodges at that time lets us examine how Masonic feminism was practiced. They defended women's emancipation and tried to differentiate from what they thought was their principal oppressor: religion. They discussed the importance of receiving an education to be prepared to work with equal rights. 1. The question of initiation, the ontological argument. I will take a principally ontological approach to this question. This approach is necessary because, as I mentioned previously, Freemasonry's defining characteristic lies in its initiation, which provides the structure and justification for all labor, consciously or unconsciously, and it is subsidiary of the ontological architecture of the human being. We should remember this truism. This is even more the case with an initiatory method designed precisely to make our most intimate work visible and manageable, so we can weave our own project on it. I am interested in approaching the issue of initiation from this point of view. First, this ontological warp is the same for every human being regardless their gender, ethnicity, or any other difference that we feel like to consider. And second, because I start from the premise that a method is only initiatory if it helps and teaches us to deal with this warp. We would have to return to the dawn of humanity to imagine at what point humans developed the desire to seek knowledge and understanding of both their environment and themselves. Teilhard and Chardin credited the appearance of reflection as the turning point in the evolution of the species. Suddenly, humans became aware of themselves and able to see themselves in their environment. Humans then thought about the meaning of their lives and their actions. This reflection led them to wonder about what is behind the visible world, guessing that the external world contains only an echo of hidden truths that they try to name, even though they are unreachable. Little by little, humans built sense to fit the meanings. They ponder the meaning of life and their own existence. Humans have gone in search of their being. The concept being invades their language and they refer to themselves as human beings. It could be said then that the corollary of reflection, what produced human specificity, lies in being. The human being is a being in the world, a world in which they exist, insofar as they are open to their being, but also a world that they interact with and on which they depend. Neither men nor women can avoid this basic condition. As for being a human whose primary and permanent task is the blended preoccupation in being already always, and because of this reflectiveness, a being that contemplates itself in the context of its environment with its precariousness on its back. This is as true for men and for women. In this prey of their occupation, of their care, lies the root of the ontological need to always hold on to their authentic originality. And this is as true for men and for women. Another determinant that weights down our being for the same reason is seeing ourselves coming to an understanding. Our existence is as an understanding being, our observation of one capable of understanding not only of the world in which we live, but of our feelings, our emotions, our ideas, and our assessment of our way of being in the world. And this is as true for men and for women. But human beings live submerged their daily life in a world that offers them occupation without the prey in exchange for sacrificing their originality, their self-determination, because daily life distances us from our origin and induces us to forget about our being. And this is as true for men and for women. Returning to the initiation tradition, perhaps we could attempt a first definition saying that it is the set of knowledge and guidelines collected throughout the history of humanity with the specific purpose of producing the encounter of the individual, of the self, with the being in its most authentic originality, a separation from daily life. This is the primordial goal of all initiating disciplines with capital letters, as it is included in the old and well-known recommendation, know yourself. The apparent simplicity and evidence of this declaration that, at first sight, we all are prepared to admit becomes full of complexity and difficulty that makes the practice of this advice almost impossible to follow. All this philosophical disquisition has been necessary to try to demonstrate that a true initiatory tradition must contain in its method, first, the keys to take responsibility of ourselves, dissipate the illusory contents of our virtual worlds where our imprisoned consciousness lives, reorder those that derive directly from the structure of our being, and start up the creative potentialities of our life choices. Second, to provide the initiate with a way of working and a scenario that forces them to exercise those potentialities in such a way that these potentialities are as automatic as much as possible, and that the fruit of this work proves the correctness of the process. Third, provide a system of values and principles that give meaning to all the work done. There are several initiatory schools, and I have researched some of them, but Freemasonry has been the only one that meets all the requirements I have just explained, and it has done so forcefully, soberly, and completely. Its discipline and teamwork confront you with your realities and your internal ghosts. Its symbols lead you to reflect on the hidden meaning of things, to seek the reality of things. Its construction metaphor makes you a worker committed to a vital project that is reinvigorated every day. Its postulates of freedom, equality, and fraternity, and its values of tolerance, wisdom, strength, and beauty frame all actions, orienting them towards hopeful horizons congruent with the evolution of life on our planet. From these premises, both women and men must travel the same path to take possession of their being, and therefore the essential content of Freemasonry is perfectly valid for both. As human beings, we build on what has existed before, even when we can change direction, extend the limits of what we see, or accept a new idea that radically alters our perspective. When women search history for the foundation of their identity as human beings, they discover that history is recorded almost exclusively by men, and it speaks of them and for them. This situation is simply a natural consequence of the old images of masculinity and femininity and of the resulting sociocultural norms. But this is not a reason for us to be deprived of the human patrimony represented by the initiatory tradition, or of any other specific knowledge whose elaboration has taken centuries and centuries, and to intend to start from scratch. Number 2. Relevance of gender in the initiatic tradition. Now, it is true that biological differences between men and women, specifically the procreative role of women, has drastically determined their place in society. Women have been responsible for generating life, caring for, and socializing, while men, free of these functions, have been free to change the world. The consolidation of these functions has developed two complementary subcultures in many aspects, but antagonistic in others. The world of men has not had barriers that limited them, and they have been able to explore all the paths where they have wanted to venture. Women, however, have seen their activities circumscribed to certain scenarios that men, self-proclaimed kings of the world, have destined for them. There is no doubt that these subcultures have generated a compendium of sensitivities, mechanisms, ghosts, and different interests in each of the genders. But these differences are still cultural influences that can be modified just as the conditions of life are altered. We cannot deny that Freemasonry is an initiatory way created by men, and that therefore we recognize certain characters made from their imprint, but these do not at all constitute the essential elements of the Masonic method, and therefore can be molded to the new situations posed by the presence of women in the lodges. If the ultimate goal of initiatory work consists of a journey that we undertake from ourself towards our being in search of our authenticity, of our cubic stone, we can only achieve this if we are able to first discover and then overcome everything, and I say everything, the a priori, all the prejudices on which our self is based. If masculinity or femininity is the last veil that conceals existence as humans, the initiatory method must also offer some devices that allow us to become aware of this concealment. Now that women have been discovered, masculinity has been brought to light, it is vital now to restore unity to the Masonic temples by assembling all the parts of the microcosm. Freemasonry is, among other things, a very complex mixture of tradition and utopia. Both terms are well understood and practiced, so their coexistence should not present a major problem. But as in any human organization, there will be combination for all tastes. The more traditional wing will tend to prioritize formality. Positing the utopia will be achieved precisely to the extent that this tradition is strictly respected. The most utopian wing will race towards the goal, throwing overboard everything that bothers them on their way, not taking into account that this will also discard the tools that will lead them to reach their goal. The most balanced approach will be that which adapts with prudence and wisdom the most formalistic combination of traditions while configuring the utopia in more realistic terms. The issue of women enters fully into this problem of the interpretation of the tradition. What I can say through my personal experience in living with Masonic groups of different sensibilities is that all obediences will adapt their constitutions and regulations so that women can be welcomed into their lodges, albeit at different speeds, just as the obediences called liberals did more than 100 years ago. The ones who will have a tougher time because of their rigid commitment to tradition are the so-called Anglo-Saxon Freemasons. But as time passes, it becomes more embarrassing to explain why they do not admit women. Is it because they don't consider that women have the qualifications or the physical, intellectual, or spiritual abilities necessary to be Freemasons? Or it is because the fundamental principles are smothered by purely formal and circumstantial issues, which do not even belong to the Masonic tradition, but to the written order without moving most sacred pillars of our institution? In any case, these adaptations must take place naturally without being forced, without men continuing to interpret what women may want, nor women trying to impose their visions from the subculture that they are trying to modify. This is a speech written by Ascensión Tejerina, past Grand Master of the GLSE, Spain.